Hey guys, DragonBoss2000 here with an updated Spright combo video. Since after the release of DABL, Spright has gotten two new cards, Spright Sprint and Spright Double Cross, which has changed how some of the combos work, so I thought it would be a good idea to update the previous combo video. So without further ado, let's just get straight into it. So for combo number one that I'm going to be showing you is what you can do with one copy of Spright Starter. So what your end board would be looking like is one Elf, one Totally Awesome, and then either one copy of Starter, one copy of Smashes, or one copy of Double Cross. This essentially gives you 3 Omni-Negates through Toad, since you can do Toad effect once, send to the graveyard, use an Elf effect to summon back the Toad, use Toad again, and then use Double Cross to summon back that copy of Toad to use Toad one more time. Each time Toad is sent to graveyard, you can also use it to add back a copy of Beaver or Swap Frog from your graveyard. So we'll start with activating Starter. Starter will summon a copy of Spright Blue, and we'll take 1100 points of damage, and then use Blue effect to search a copy of Jet. We'll then use Jet effect to special summon itself, and then search our copy of a spell trap, Spright Spell Trap. In this situation, I'm searching a copy of Double Cross, but this could also be a copy of Smashes or Starter. We'll then link these two cards off to summon a copy of Spright Sprint, and we'll then trigger the effect of Sprint to send a copy of Angler. We'll then use the effect of Angler to summon a copy of Beaver, and another copy of Beaver. We'll then exceed the Sprint and a copy of Beaver into a copy of Gigantic, and then use Gigantic effect. We'll detach the copy of Beaver, and then summon a copy of Swap Frog. We'll then use the copy of Swap Frog to then dump another copy of Swap Frog, and then link these two into a copy of Spright Elf. We'll then use Spright Elf effect, targeting the copy of Swap Frog in our graveyard to summon it back, and then exceed into a copy of Totally Awesome. So like I said before, we'll be able to use Toad. Toad will then negate something, and then we'll be able to add us back a copy of Beaver. We'll then be able to bring back the Toad using Elf to then use Toad again. We can then use Toad to add back a copy of Swap Frog, and then we can then use Double Cross targeting the Toad to summon it back. Then use Toad again just to add back another copy of Angler in this situation, I think. And then that way we get Swap Frog to discard Angler to then summon another Beaver from our deck, because we can go up to 2 and we still have more Beaver left in the deck, giving us 2 bodies for free, plus we have the normal summon Beaver for another additional normal summon. So just by one starter we get 3 cards as follow-up, 3 Omnis, and then we also still have 4 more cards left in hand. For the second combo that I'm going to show you is what you can do with just one copy of Beaver. This is a similar end board to Starter, where you'll end on Toad. However, you'll only be having 2 Toad negates since you won't have access to your Spright cards. So we'll start off with normal summon Beaver, Beaver effect, summon a copy of Angler from our deck. We'll then link these two off into a copy of Spright Sprint, trigger the effect of Spright Sprint, sending Angler to graveyard. Use the effect of Angler to summon 2 copies of Beaver from our deck. We'll then exceed the Spright Sprint into a copy of Gigantic. Use Gigantic effect detaching the Beaver, summoning a copy of Swap Frog. Swap Frog effect dumping another copy of Swap Frog. Linking these two off again into Spright Elf. Spright Elf effect target back the Swap Frog, summon it back. Exceeds with the 2 Swap Frogs to make a copy of Totally Awesome. And then you end on 2 Toad negates plus the 2 Toad add backs, which can be a copy of Beaver and a copy of Swap Frog. However, something to note here is that if you do add back Swap Frog, and if you add back Angler, you will not be able to resolve Angler because you do not have any more nimble targets left in deck. So that's something to keep in mind. However, you still add back the Swap Frog, because if your opponent uses a Shizu card or something to put back an Angler to deck, or put back a Beaver to deck, if you somehow top deck it, or if you top deck a better normal summon for whatever reason, whatever it could be, you can then use the Swap Frog to discard the Beaver or the top deck into to summon it, and that way you don't have to use your normal summon. However, it doesn't really make it too much of a difference. It's just an additional card that you can have in hand to keep card advantage. The next combo I want to show you guys is what you can do with a copy of Spright Blue plus any level 2 that isn't Swap Frog. For Swap Frog, there's a different combo that I'll show later. So to start off with, we'll be normal summoning Angler. We'll then use Blue effect to special summon, and then trigger Blue effect to search a copy of Jet. We'll then special summon the copy of Jet and use its effect to search a copy of Double Cross. We'll then link the Angler and the Blue to summon a copy of Gigantic Spright, trigger the effect of Gigantic Spright, sending a copy of Angler to summon 2 copies of Beaver. We'll then exceed the copy of Gigantic Spright and the Beaver to summon a copy of Gigantic Spright, and then use the Gigantic Spright effect to summon a copy of Swap Frog from our deck. We'll then trigger the Swap Frog effect, sending a copy of Swap Frog, and then we have 2 options here. We can either link these 2 off to summon IP, and then link the IP and the Jet into Elf, so we have IP in graveyard. Or we can just link these 2 off, go straight into IP, keep the Gigantic Spright on field, so that way if our opponent does end up outing the Elf and the Toad with Lava Golem, we at least have Double Cross that's still live to then attach the targeted card to our Gigantic Spright. So I like going for this play where I link these 2 off into a copy of Elf, then use Elf effect to summon back to a copy of Swap Frog, exceeds into a copy of Totally Awesome, and then set the Double Cross. This way if our opponent does Lava Golem us, or we still have our Double Cross live. Something to note is that this doesn't have to be Double Cross, this can also be starter or smashes. However, I just like going for Double Cross since we can always summon back blue for follow-up if need be, and our Toad will be adding us back the Beaver and Swap Frogs. So for this next combo, I'm going to show you what you can do with a copy of Swap Frog and a copy of Spright Blue. So you'll start off by normal summoning a copy of Swap Frog, using its effect to send another copy of Swap Frog from our deck to the graveyard. We'll then special summon a copy of Spright Blue, use its effect to search a copy of Spright Jet. We'll then special summon the copy of Spright Jet, use its effect to search a copy of either Spright Double Cross, Spright Smashes, or Spright Starter. We'll then link 2 into a copy of Spright Sprint, use its effect to send a copy of Nimble Angler. We'll then use Nimble Angler effect to summon 2 copies of Nimble Beaver from our deck. We'll then use Spright Sprint and Nimble Beaver to a copy of Gigantic Spright, and then use Gigantic Spright effect to summon your copy of either Spright Carrot, Spright Red, Iperia, or Capshell, depending on what you play. You can also decide based off what you think is more necessary. So I normally, if I'm going first, like to summon a copy of Capshell, since this gives me an additional draw, and I want to be drawing more non-engine cards when I'm going first to sort of help support my board. So then I'll link these 2 copies of Nimble Beaver and Capshell into a copy of Spright Elf, use the effect of Capshell to draw a card, then use the effect of Spright Elf to summon back our copy of Swap Frog that we dumped at the beginning of the turn. We'll then exceed using the 2 copies of Swap Frog into a copy of Totally Awesome. We'll set out a copy of Double Cross, keep this other card in hand, and then we'll have the same input that we normally do with Triple Toad using Double Cross, plus 1 additional card in hand, plus Toad add back for our copies of Beaver and Angler. This next combo I'm going to show you guys is what you can do with a copy of Swap Frog and a copy of Spright Jet. So we'll start off by normally summoning a copy of Swap Frog, using the effect of Swap Frog to send a copy of Swap Frog from our deck to the graveyard. We'll then use a Jet to special summon itself, and then use Jet effect to search a copy of Spright Starter. We'll then activate the effect of Spright Starter to summon a copy of Spright Blue. We'll take 1100 points of damage, and then use the effect of Spright Blue, searching a copy of Spright Red. We'll then special summon our copy of Spright Red, and then link our Spright Jet and our Spright Blue into a copy of Spright Sprint. We'll then use our copy of Spright Sprint, sending a copy of Nimble Angler to summon a copy of Nimble Beaver, and another copy of Nimble Beaver. We'll then exceed into the Gigantic Spright, use the effect of Gigantic Spright, summoning either Capshell, Iperia, or Spright Carrot, depending on what you play or what you want to end on. I like going for Capshell since I want to be drawing cards during turn 1. We'll link our copy of Capshell and our copy of Nimble Beaver to summon a copy of Spright Elf, trigger the effect of Capshell to draw a card, use the effect of Elf to summon back the Swap Frog we dumped at the beginning of the turn, exceeds into a copy of Totally Awesome, and end on 2 Toad, negates 1 red interruption and 1 random card in hand. The final combo I'm going to show you guys today is if you draw any level 2 monster that isn't Swap Frog and any Spright monster that isn't Blue or Jet. So we'll start off by normal summoning Angler, special summon Red. We'll then link these 2 off into a copy of Spright Sprint, use the effect of Sprint, sending a copy of Angler. We'll then use the effect of Angler, summoning 2 copies of Beaver, exceeds into a copy of Gigantic, use the Gigantic effect to summon a copy of Swap Frog, use Swap Frog effect to send another copy of Swap Frog from the deck to the graveyard, link 2 into a copy of Spright Elf, use the effect of Elf to summon back a copy of Swamp Frog, and then exceeds into a copy of Totally Awesome. So, although the hand was like pretty bad, we still have 3 cards in hand, which are probably hand traps or going second cards, and we end on double Toad negate, plus we get to add back Beaver during our opponent's turn. So even though our hand was pretty bad in that situation, we still end on quite a few interruptions plus 1.